In the Qing dynasty, merchants moved enormous amounts of silver back and forth across the country every day, from the north to the Jiangnan region, from Jiangnan all the way south to Lingnan. Along the way, they had to hire armed escorts, pay off checkpoints, and guard against the bandits. Hundreds of thousands of taels of silver traveling south for months, attracting danger every single day. The risk was enormous. The cost was enormous. And yet, everyone assumed this was simply how business was done. No one found it strange, because once something has existed long enough, people forget that it could have looked completely different. There was a young clerk at Qing by the name of Lei Lutei. His job was unremarkable. Every day he sat in the account room, recording his employer's payments, receipts, and silver transfers between different cities. But it was precisely this unassuming position that gave him a perspective no one else had. His employer focused on trade, eyes fixed on profit. The escorts focused on protection, eyes fixed on safety. Only the person sitting in the accounts room could see both things at once: where the money came from and where it had to go. One day, he noticed something in the ledger. His employer had money to collect in one city and money to pay in another. Two sums, moving in opposite directions, roughly the same amount. By convention, both had to be physically transported, each taking its own route, each carrying its own risks. He stared at the ledger for a long time. Then he asked a question. Why couldn't the accounts move instead of the silver? Years later, people would call this a commercial innovation. But at the time, it was simply an opportunity that one ordinary clerk had noticed. While sitting in front of a ledger, he kept the idea to himself for a long time before he said anything. When he finally told his employer, the response was neither immediate agreement nor immediate refusal. There was a long silence, not because the idea seemed absurd, but because the cost and risk of transporting silver had grown impossible to ignore. Silver lost on the road was a real loss. If a piece of paper could actually work, at least part of that risk would shift. Eventually, his employer said, "Let's try." But trying was easier said than done. The first obstacle wasn't how to write the note. It was how to find the first person willing to use it. In those early months, most merchants who heard the idea simply shook their heads and walked away. Silver you could see, silver you could touch, but a piece of paper. What if you arrived and no one honored it? Still, a few merchants began to waver, not because they trusted the paper, but because the dangers of transporting silver had made them even more afraid of losing it on the road. Weighing one risk against another, some decided to take the chance. The first draft note went out. The merchant who carried it traveled hundreds of li, arrived at the agreed location, and handed over the note, with no certainty of what would happen next. The clerk on the other side checked it carefully, then began counting out silver. One tael, another tael, exact to the last coin, placed on the counter. The merchant was silent for a long moment. Then he asked for a second note, right then and there. Trust is built one transaction at a time. In those early years, Qing was not focused on profit. Every transfer had to be honored on time, to the exact amount. Better to earn less on a single transaction than to let any transaction go wrong, because they understood one default would not just cost a customer, it would destroy everyone's trust in the paper. And so, one transaction at a time, word spread. Merchants who had used it told those who hadn't. Those who hadn't became willing to try for the first time. Li Xiangchang had turned a piece of paper into something more trusted than silver. None of this could have happened without the conditions of that era. Shaanxi merchants were rising. Long-distance trade between north and south was expanding rapidly. Large quantities of silver being transported for months at a time, attracting risk every day. The entire commercial system had long been waiting for a new tool, but no one knew what that tool should look like. Lei Lutai didn't create the demand. He simply saw what the demand actually looked like, and was the first to provide an answer. Li Xiangchang went on to become one of the most representative draft banks of the Qing dynasty, its influence lasting nearly 200 years. History remembers the institution, not the name of Lei Lutai, but his story points to something simple. An ordinary person doesn't need to have the most resources or the highest position, but if they stand somewhere others can see and notice a problem others have missed, they may be able, one step at a time, to turn an idea into something real. Opportunity does not come looking for you. It tends to hide in the places everyone has grown so used to that almost no one thinks to question them anymore.